Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, for being with us and for your interest in this work. As I mentioned, I'm with the World Justice Project, the executive director there, and really pleased to take this opportunity to share our latest report out today on global insights on access to justice. It reflects the first ever global survey of access to justice in a systematic way in 101 countries. My colleague Sarah Long will walk you through some of the highlights of the data in just a moment. But I just really want to introduce the WJP briefly and this work and some of the partnerships that have contributed to it over the years. So those of you who don't know WJP, we've been around for about 10 years. We are a global multidisciplinary organization, a think tank for the rule of law community, and see ourselves as a resource for that community through our data collection and analysis, our research, our support for teaching in the on issues of rule of law, and also support for a global network of actors like those of you here in the room and on the phone working on rule of law and justice issues. So we're really pleased to have you all here to share this data and to think together in I hope what will be a very interactive discussion about what do we do on the basis of this research. We quite intentionally are releasing this report 2 weeks or a week and a half before the high-level political forum. We wanted to take advantage of a little calm before the storm of all those meetings that will be happening here in New York and convene our community to talk about this data and what it means and our path forward in acting on the justice gap. This is the culmination of a year-long effort, a year-plus long effort at the WJP, supported by many of the people on the phone and in the room, most notably OSJI worked with us from the very beginning in the pilots of this methodology and supported that work. We've worked very closely with the Pathfinders and contributed data analysis to the Pathfinders Task Force on Justice and their report, and I know Micah will speak to that. We're grateful to the Mott Foundation that's also been supportive of this work. And it has been about data collection and analysis in the form of this report, also a companion study that contributed to the Pathfinder's work on measuring the justice gap globally. But importantly, we also have been very much focused on access to justice in our convenings, and our World Justice Forum this spring had a theme on access to justice, not only to highlight the problem, but also to bring people together to begin to identify solutions and work toward those. And then most recently, we've been working with a number of colleagues, including UNDP, on thinking about an indicator and measurement in this area for the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that introduction, I would like to invite my colleague, Sarah Long, who has really led this work at WJP over the last year and a half or 2 years, to share with you the highlights of the data. And then we will have a brief conversation among the panelists here, and then move to a broader conversation with those of you around the table and on the phone. Sarah.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Betsy and Matt. So before I delve right into some of the key findings of the study, how to navigate the country profiles in the reports, and also some of the cross-country trends, I wanted to start first with a little bit of background about the methodology behind this data and how we designed the study. So as some of you may already know, the World Justice Project produces a rule of law index, which we publish on an annual basis. And this is a quantitative assessment tool designed to measure the rule of law as it's experienced by ordinary people around the world. And one of the primary data sources that feeds into our rule of law index is a general population poll. This is a household survey administered to 1,000 people in every country measured in our index. The general population poll has a combination of experience and perception-based questions, which capture people's experiences and perceptions of a variety of rule of law issues. This includes trust in institutions, perceptions of corruption, crime victimization, and bribery victimization, among many other issues. Countries are polled on a biannual basis, so we poll about half the countries in odd years and half the countries in even years. We contract local polling companies to conduct these surveys. So they translate the survey, adapt it to the local language and context, and primarily administer the survey face-to-face. So just to give you an idea of what this data collection exercise looks like, I've included here a picture of the administration of the general population poll in Nepal, in Mozambique, Bulgaria, Mexico, and Afghanistan. So the idea here was to include a survey module on legal needs and access to justice in our general population poll. So the module itself contains 118 questions. So it starts by first taking inventory of legal problems that people might have experienced in the past 2 years. So the survey covers 38 different types of legal problems, and then the interviewer walks the respondent through their process to navigate their legal problems that they've experienced. And I've put up here on the screen 11 different themes that are covered in the Access to Justice module, but in broad terms, it looks at the types of problems experienced, how serious they were, where people go for help or to resolve their problems, their perceptions and experiences with the resolution process, the outcome of the problem, and its broader impact on their life. So just to give a bit more of a visual representation of the flow of the survey module, up here on the screen, I've tried to summarize a little bit these 118 questions into a bit of a flow chart. So you can see that the module starts with taking inventory of the problems experienced, then asking respondents where they went for help, and if they did not seek help, why not? Then did they take action? And by taking action, we mean turning to a resolution mechanism for adjudication or mediation, and if so, where they went. Then we ask about the status of their problem. If it's done, what was the manner of conclusion? And then we collect data on the process to resolve the problem. So how long did it take? Was it expensive? Was the process itself fair? And how satisfied is the respondent with the outcome? Then we ask respondents to assess their own legal capability. So did they know their rights or come to understand their rights? Could they access good information and help? Could they get adequate expert help should they need it? And how confident were they in their ability to resolve the problem? And lastly, we look at hardship. So how did their problem impact their life? And we ask questions about financial hardship, relationship breakdown, ill health, or abuse of alcohol or drugs as a result of their legal problem. So again, this is just a high-level overview, but you can download the Access to Justice survey module from our website. So how did we go about designing the study? So this study builds on a long Path to Justice legal needs survey tradition. Prior to conducting the study, there had been about 50 or so legal needs surveys conducted in 30 countries over the course of the past 25 years. But these surveys did not have a standardized methodology, and they primarily focused on developed countries. So it made it very difficult to get a comprehensive view of the state of access to justice in countries in different regions and with different levels of economic development. So in 2016, we first developed this module and piloted it in 61 countries. And in the course of developing and piloting a module, we participated in an expert advisory group convened by OSJI and the OECD. And this advisory group included representatives from governments, including statistical agencies, as well as ministries of justice, as well as civil society and academics working on justice measurement issues. So we benefited greatly from the input of this advisory stream on how to design this pilot module. And in return, we shared information and lessons learned from piloting the module with this advisory group. And this ultimately fed into a methodological guidance document called Legal Needs Surveys and Access to Justice, which was recently released by OSJI and the OECD. We also used this information to refine our survey instrument and collect 2 more rounds of data in 2017 and 2018. So this covered 101 countries, and this is the data that is in the report in front of you today. So what kind of data can you expect to see in the report for a given country? Again, there are a large number of questions in this survey, so for the purposes of the country profile, we had to condense the data into a few key themes for each country. But on our website, we have summary statistics available for download that provides additional information beyond what is in the country profile. So the data is organized around 6 key themes or parts. The first part of the country profile looks at the incidence of legal problems. So overall, how many people experienced at least one legal problem in the last 2 years. And then we also show the breakdown of problems by category. We cover 38 types of legal problems, but for the purpose of the country profile, they are grouped into 12 broad categories. Next, we look at respondents' legal capabilities. So what were the tools they felt that they had at their disposal when trying to resolve their problem? So could they access information? Could they access expert help? And how confident were they in their ability to resolve the problem? Next, regardless of their perception of their legal capability, did they actually access any form of help? And we cover a wide variety of advisors, from family, friends, community and religious leaders to professional advisors, including lawyers, employers, welfare professionals, among others. On the bottom of the profile, we look at what proportion of people were able to fully resolve their problem versus how many report that their problem is done, but it just persists and they've given up any action to try to resolve it further. Next, we look at the perceptions and experiences of the process. So was the process fair? How long did it take? And how difficult was it to find the money necessary to resolve their problem? And lastly, we look at hardship. So what percentage of people experienced any hardship? And then we break it down into health, economic, and interpersonal hardships, as well as substance abuse as a result of the legal problem. So what do we find globally? So our first finding is that legal problems are ubiquitous. About half of people surveyed experienced at least one legal problem in the last 2 years. And this looks different across countries. It varies, but overall, we find that consumer problems, housing problems, and financial problems are among the most common. We also find, as Matthew mentioned in his earlier remarks, that low-income respondents are more likely to experience legal problems, and this finding is even stronger in high-income countries. In terms of what people do to resolve their problems, most people do not go to courts and lawyers. Most people prefer to get advice from family members and friends, and they prefer not to go to a resolution mechanism, but instead to work out the problem directly with the other party, independently do what the other party wants, or just wait for the problem to, quote unquote, sort itself out. And it isn't necessarily a problem if people are able to meet their legal needs without going to courts and lawyers, but we do find that there are some troubling trends in the data about reasons why people are not able to meet their legal needs. So we find that about 1 in 6 people report that it was difficult or nearly impossible to find the money needed to resolve their problem. And less than a third are getting any form of information, advice, or representation to help them understand or resolve their problem. And about 1 in 6 people globally report that their problem persists, but they've simply given up any action to try to resolve it further. And this is important because we also are finding that justice problems impact people's lives, with 1 in 4 people reporting that they experienced a stress-related or physical illness as a result of their legal problem, and more than 1 in 5 reporting losing their job, losing income, or needing to relocate as a result of their legal problem. So this is really just a visual representation of some of the figures that I just touched on, but this is kind of what the global view of path to justice looks like. So again, you can see about half of people experiencing a legal problem, with consumer, housing, and financial problems being the most common, less than a third of people accessing help, and those who do primarily turning to family and friends, less than half of people globally reporting that their problem is done and fully resolved, and 43% experiencing any hardship, with health-related and economic hardships being the most common. But taking a deeper look at the data and the cross-country trends, what do we see? So we said overall about half of people experience legal problems, but the actual distribution from, incidence of legal problems from country to country varies pretty greatly, ranging from 14% to 89% of people who experienced a legal problem in the last 2 years. And if we want to look at that by problem category, you can see here we've picked 20 countries included in our study and show the incidence of specific categories of legal problems. And you can see here that, again, consumer, financial, and housing problems are the most common, with some notable outliers, such as issues relating to community and natural resources being the most prevalent in Pakistan, or issues relating to money and debt being very common in the United States. So where do people go to actually mediate or adjudicate their problem? So here we can see what proportion did not take any action versus the proportion who went to formal and informal mechanisms. So you can see across all countries, most people do not go to a resolution mechanism. And then you can see in red what proportion went to informal mechanisms. This includes community or religious leaders, as well as mediators, versus formal mechanisms. And this includes courts, tribunals, government offices, and the police, among others. And this kind of a purple or brown overlap shows the proportion who are going to both. So in our survey, people can respond if they went to multiple places. So we also are seeing across countries, people who do take action are following a variety of avenues to try to resolve their problems. Also in our survey, included in our questions about legal capability, we asked people, how would you describe your problem? Would you describe it as bad luck, a private or family matter, a financial matter? And they can answer any of these. But interestingly, we see that most people do not perceive their problems as being legal in nature. And this means they might not recognize that there is a legal remedy for their problem. And this is interesting when viewed against these orange X marks, which shows what proportion of people who answered each of these questions actually obtained any form of help, whether it was professional or not professional help. And we see that people who can identify their problem as legal are more likely to get any form of help. So this is really an interesting gap, given that less than 30% of people are even recognizing their problems as being legal in nature. And again, going back to the theme of hardship. So on the top of the slide, we have the proportion who experienced any hardship, as well as specific types of hardship, with health and financial hardships being the most common. But we can see that also by category of problem, the hardships experienced range greatly, with people reporting family-related problems related to accidental illness and injury, and employment disputes experiencing the greatest hardships. And again, looking at this theme of inequality of experience, this is a trend we see across our data, with low-income respondents reporting higher incidence of legal problems. So here we can see with the green dot, the average percentage of people who reported experiencing a legal problem who were also recipients of government benefits or some form of government assistance, as opposed to those who do not receive government assistance, represented by the purple dot. And we can see in almost every country that those who receive government benefits are more likely to experience legal problems. And this finding is also true for people who are unemployed or report lower earnings. So what next? It is our hope that this study can provide the methodological basis for countries to conduct their own legal needs survey using a standard methodology that can be applied across different countries and contexts. And that they can use this data to report out on the state of access to justice in their country and monitor their progress, particularly in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We also want to do more analysis of this data set. The data I've presented today and that you see in your report is really just the tip of the iceberg. And we really like to produce more research on what are some of the drivers of inequality of experience and inequality of outcomes. And also, we're not just conducting the study for the sake of data, it is for the sake of actually improving access to justice. So we'd like to apply the same type of rigor that went into this report into actually studying what works to improve access to justice. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and for that presentation and for the work, which has really been significant over the last couple of years. Maybe I can turn to you, Aparna, here from UNDP to comment on the data and how it relates to your work, and then I'll come back to you, Matt.
Yep, sounds great. First of all, thank you to the World Justice Project and to OSF for inviting me to speak today. I want to first also congratulate you on the publication of the study, and just to say a couple words on the overall study. So I think from our perspective, it's really what's really useful in terms of the study itself is understanding what the situation is at the country level, what sort of problems people face, how they are choosing to resolve their problems, who they're seeking for help, and whether or not they're able to obtain a remedy for their grievances. This particular focus on civil justice, I think, also highlights, in terms of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the interlinkages between access to justice and other parts of the agenda, Goal 16 certainly, but also in terms of addressing inequality, reducing poverty, gender equality, etc. So I think that also is a really useful data to have in the context of making an argument for how access to justice is at the center of pushing as a driver for the overall agenda for sustainable development. I thought it was also interesting looking at the data that you presented around the impact of legal problems and the hardship people face, because I think it touches upon the cost of legal problems. And I think that is also a really compelling argument for countries, and particularly ministries of planning or ministries of finance, to think about the cost at a personal level in terms of the physical cost or cost of illness, but also in terms of economic and social costs of not having access to justice or having a large number of legal problems. So it really is an argument for why justice needs to be part of national development planning processes, national and why justice sector reform also needs to be considered strongly as part of budgeting processes. So I think that was a very useful point to make. A few additional points on why this sort of evidence matters. I think from our perspective, data on civil justice is really important to have a holistic understanding of access to justice. The current SDG framework it looks at issues around criminal justice, so it does look at issues of victimization rates or rates of pretrial detention, but the aspect around civil justice and people's access to justice for civil matters is missing, and that I think leaves out a significant part of what people need in terms of access to justice. And this is also important, particularly in the context of leaving no one behind. For marginalized populations, access to civil justice is also very significant. So the other point I wanted to make is that how the data in this report can also illustrate the interlinkages between poverty, inequality, and lack of access to justice. Earlier this year, we had a consultation in Latin America where this came up very, very strongly, where one of the main issues was the interlinkage between violence, insecurity, and injustice, and how access to justice can also be a part of an indicator, a multidimensional indicator of poverty. And so looking at SDG 16, the consultation was on SDG 16. The key issues that came out is also we need to look at the socioeconomic dimensions of SDG 16, and civil justice issues is central to that. And then the other point I wanted to make is around, I think you've also raised it, how access to civil justice issues is not only an issue for developing country context, but is a universal concern. And the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda is a universal agenda. So access to justice for civil issues also needs to be addressed in order to address systematic discrimination and violation of rights faced by low-income and marginalized populations across development contexts. So I just want to end by noting that this is a very timely, not only for the HLPF, the report, but also because we're working very closely with OECD, with World Justice Project, and OSJI in proposing an indicator for the SDG framework. We're proposing an additional indicator on SDG 16.3, drawing on the work of the legal needs survey that OSJI and OECD have done, but also in terms of the methodology and the data collection done by World Justice Project and presented in this report to showcase that it is possible to collect this data and that it is comparable data across countries. So We had just submitted the proposal for the indicator a few weeks ago. The interagency expert group on the SDGs will be discussing it over the next 2 months, and there will be an open consultation in August where I think it's open widely, where people can provide inputs on and provide feedback on the methodology of the indicator and whether this is a useful indicator to have in the SDG framework. So I'll just end there, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Matthew, maybe I can turn back to you before we open it up. We've proven that we can measure the gap. It's maybe a careful what you wish for situation because it's so big. But you at OSJI are thinking and doing lots to prove that we can actually plug that gap. So tell us a little bit about what the solutions are.
Sure. So a lot of my focus within JI is on sort of social innovation. So thinking about ways that applied data, technology, innovative financing can be used to address some of these needs. And I think the reason why this measurement work is so critical is because it actually gets us to focus on the right things. And I think in the past we've focused a lot on the role of courts and the role of lawyers. I think both with our legal empowerment model as well as the ways in which we understand legal capability and the opportunities to educate and to empower individuals are really critical to how we address the justice gap. So I think part of that response and part of the way in which legal needs measurement and data is critical is that it helps us to better formulate and understand potential impacts that we might have beyond just lawyers and courts.
Okay. And what is it in the data that kind of jumps out at you that focus that you think now this is where we should be focusing?
I think it's almost always legal capability for me. I think it's a lot about how people understand the law, their availability of the law and their access to the law, how they understand their problems and whether or not they understand them as legal problems and ways in which we might approach that and do more to address opportunities for folks to have greater awareness of both what the law is and how they might in fact effectuate meaningful ways of addressing their legal problems.
And what are some of the successful ways in which addressing legal capability gaps you see emerging?
Well, I think certainly the legal empowerment framework as a model of kind of thinking about a grassroots movement, a sort of bottom-up approach to addressing justice needs. I also think that there's a lot of interesting things that are happening around technology and thinking about ways in which to better approach legal information, legal education, and rights awareness. I also think that there are opportunities to think more about the ways in which just an understanding of the data, and in particular administrative data, pulled from civil society organizations and other justice interventions can really help us to better understand what the impacts of those interventions are and how we might scale and sustain them over time.
I think we'll open it up to a broader conversation. I want to maybe start first with Micah DeLongen to situate this conversation in what we anticipate with the high-level political forum, the work that Pathfinders is doing, and where do you think we should go with this effort next?
Great, yeah, thank you so much. So we're very happy to have this report. So congratulations on completing it and bringing it to us here in New York right ahead of the HLPF, which is great timing. So this is the Justice for All report that we have launched in April, and I'll say a few words about that. Because and so I wanted to say one of the things we present in this report, I'll talk about that, is the global justice gap. But a lot of people then asked us, well, okay, so that's at the global level. Do you have country level data? And I said, well, it's coming, but now it's here. So now everybody who wants to know more, dive into at least the national level has this report. So I think that's a very valuable resource. So on the Task Force on Justice is a group of people led by three ministers from the Netherlands, Sierra Leone, and Argentina, who really wanted to take forward this challenge of providing access to justice for all, as it is promised in the 2030 agenda in SDG 16. as was mentioned before. And the first question actually that the task force wanted to tackle is what is the justice, what kind of justice do people want and need versus what is the justice that they get. And that's really the concept of this global justice gap. And we've worked with a lot of partners, and most importantly with the World Justice Project to actually be able to present that data of the global justice gap, the 5.1 billion people overall who do not have meaningful access to justice. But more specifically, and I think as the most valuable contribution to that is that number of 1.5 billion people who cannot resolve their everyday justice problems, and that is very much based on this work. And it's really to underline that understanding that we're getting, that this is not just an issue of developing countries, but it's actually all over the world. And we really have to make a big investment and smarter investment than we have been doing to bridge that gap. One of the reasons that it's perhaps surprising, but that data was not out there yet, is that justice data has traditionally been focused on administrative data coming from the courts on how many cases they have, maybe on how long the cases take. But this data is I think very valuable because it takes the perception perspective. So it asks people what problems they have and what solutions they find. And I think that's an important contribution also because it underpins the discussion and the recommendations also of the task force that we need to put people at the center of justice systems and really take that perspective, what justice systems are providing and where they are falling short from what people need. And if you take that perspective, you have to also take a very broad understanding of the justice system, because when you start with the legal needs, with the justice problems that people face, I think this is also what you highlighted from the data. Courts are only a very small piece of the solution. There's a wide range of actors that are needed. Courts are, of course, extremely important in any system, but it's only a very small part of the solution. And so I think that opens up the discussion on who are the actors, who are the people who can help people resolve these problems. The other thing I think that's also in your presentation, also in the report, is what are the most common problems? So you described those categories, and we were very grateful for your contribution in also highlighting at the global level what are the 6 key problems that people face. Because once you start looking at the problems that people have, it automatically opens up the spectrum of actors and solutions that you want to look at. Lastly, just Aparna also already covered this in her presentation, but I think it's a very important contribution on the indicator. So in the SDG context, measurement is a big discussion. National statistics offices have a key role to play in that, but they typically use, if they have justice data at all, it's typically, again, this administrative data about courts and from maybe a little bit from the Ministry of Justice, but not this very important crucial component of perception data and people's actual experiences. This proposal that's been put forward is I think very important. It's actually also one of the things that the task force recommended that this be adopted, just to give that also a political push, because I think there's quite some debate that will have to take place before it happens. But both World Justice Project, OSJI, UNEP, OECD have been doing great work to really push that forward. So
good. Okay. Let me open it up to questions first here in the room, and we'll see if there are any on the phone as well.
There's one behind.
Okay. Right here, yes.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to point out at the general value of this approach for all those working on the different areas of SDG 16, because this is really an example of how non-official data, perception, and experience-based data can actually allow to properly understand the problems and therefore defining policies, and also monitoring process the progress on the implementation of the agenda. And the World Justice Project is part of a partnership which was created precisely to look at these type of data. It's the SDG 16 Data Initiative. International IDEA is also part of it, and we have been very proud in presenting this experience also at the Rome conference on SDG 16, where we also listened to some representatives of national statistical offices, to pick on what you just said. It is clear that there is an understanding also on their side of the importance of these data. There is a close attention paid to the quality and the standards and the benchmarking for these data, but this is a good example also of a high quality, solid methodological design which responds to that need. So I think it's something that we should look much more into the broader picture of how non-official data may be used in this respect. One final point about my own perspective. I deal with democracy and elections. So it is very important to look also at electoral justice. Electoral justice has been at the core at resolving disputes that may turn also into conflict or exacerbate conflict in post-conflict or conflict vulnerable situations. And that is why we are working together with the electoral management bodies and the electoral tribunals of member states around the world on developing indicators and metrics to address electoral justice. And in fact, in the high-level political forum, we are also organizing a side event with the Electoral Tribunal of Mexico on an index on electoral justice. And of course, there will be also a side event at which we will propose some of the trends, including on 16.3, thanks to the World Justice Project as the SDG 16 data initiative.
Wonderful, thank you.
I have a question of what you use to beyond your surveys in the various countries. In the United States, in New York, and I'm particularly aware because I was involved, but in a number of other states, there have been statistically valid legal need studies that have been undertaken directed to civil legal needs. And these studies have helped to provide the intellectual underpinning for things such as IOLA, interest on lawyer account funds being used for support of civil legal needs through programs throughout the various 50 jurisdictions. I think the Legal Services Corporation, which is a national entity that provides funds for civil legal services, has also undertaken a study. I think their study may have been a little bit narrower because what they can support is limited by what Congress has limited them to, so that, for example, immigration issues are not included, or most immigration issues. But there are studies in quite a number of states in the United States, and I just wondered whether they were looked at or considered, or whether you might consider doing so after the fact.
So, yeah, I can share a few examples that I've seen of really interesting approaches to non-survey based approaches to collecting data on these issues. So
these were surveys.
Yes, the Legal Services Corporation was a survey. And we also know that there are ongoing legal needs surveys being planned for South Africa and Argentina, for example. But in terms of non-survey based data, at our forum, there was a really interesting example coming out of Ukraine, where they have these one-stop shops where people can go to resolve all of their administrative problems. And so they can collect all of this data to target people's legal needs. And they were finding through these one-stop shops that there was a really high prevalence of women having trouble getting alimony payments. So they had this communications campaign called I Have a Right that was targeted to women in Ukraine who are having issues related to alimony. I also heard some really interesting examples coming out of South Africa where their community advice offices have case management systems that are really advanced. They've been developing them since I think 2011, and their community paralegals are required to enter a lot of extensive information about their cases and track them over time. And so this complements the legal needs survey data that they're collecting. So these are really interesting examples. I think one of the issues is that they are kind of scattered. And another problem is that, and this is I think a challenge that is unique to civil justice is that people take their problems to a lot of different places, and oftentimes these actors aren't speaking to each other, or there's not a central coordinating body to collect all of this non-survey data. So I think that legal needs surveys should absolutely be complementary to other forms of administrative data. I think just most countries are grappling with how to coordinate all of those different data collection efforts and to put in place systems like we see in Ukraine and South Africa.
Okay, I think I have a question here.
Sure, I'm David Udell, National Center for Access to Justice, based at Fordham around the corner. We run the Justice Index at justiceindex.org. And I just want to say I think this is a huge advance, and I appreciate its comprehensiveness and its detail. The fact that the data is going to be available for study by other people. The whole thing is just fantastic. I want to comment on just a few thoughts that have emerged as we've gone along. One is in the United States, where we have all these same concerns, I think some of us are starting to think that the civil and criminal justice systems and the civil and criminal justice indicators are much better understood if thought of as a unified system. And that, so it's not only a problem that the UN has not yet focused on civil justice indicators and targets and data points, targets, indicators, and data points. It's also a problem that we aren't thinking in terms of the way in which the civil justice system drives people into the criminal justice system, whether it's through eviction or debt or domestic violence or other kinds of problems that people have. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And then if I could, I would make or sort of raise one more question, which is that it's very interesting for me, since we do policy mapping of rules and laws across the United States that are intended to make courts more or less accessible, to think about the intersection between these kinds of legal capability, legal capacity, or capacity to assert yourself, to protect your rights, the intersection between all of that and, on the other hand, the policies that make legal systems more or less accessible. So I think it opens up a window on that kind of work also, some of which is already covered in the report and others of which will be brought, I think, toward the report for future study. And in that regard, I want to highlight also there's the problem of substantive law. You know, if you win your case because you have very, very effective, let's say, legal representation, if you have very, very effective legal representation, you stand a chance of winning your case. And you do better in some countries than others and under some legal regimes than others. And I think that is, I don't think, answered by the report yet, although what the report does is take a huge step toward empowering people to grapple with that kind of question. So thank you. And that's all I wanted to say.
Great, thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Hi, sorry, I have a very maybe too detail-oriented technical question. So I was looking at Pakistan, for example, with some bias because I'm Pakistani by birth. And I noticed in part 4 you have status. And so you have fully resolved and problem persists. So for example, in Pakistan, that comes to 32%. Then in the next step, part 5, you have process. And then we have 75% of people felt that the process was fair. So is that 75% reflective then only of the 32%?
That is reflective of both groups in that category.
Yes.
So in that box, it's people who say their problem is done and fully resolved or done because they've given up. And both groups of those people get the process questions. What is not shown in the profile are the proportion of people whose problem is still ongoing.
Right.
And so they don't get those process questions. They're only asked in the survey, how do you feel about the process so far? And so for that reason, we didn't show them in the profile since they're not captured in that next step where they're asked about how the process was.
Okay, good. That's what I thought. So if I wanted to unpack such a high proportion of people finding that the process was fair, do you have, for example, socioeconomic data about those people? Because at first blush, when I look at that, and I didn't study it, but I would imagine that very wealthy people were able to resolve their cases, get it to the completion point, and then of course they would find the process very fair. So do you also have that data as well?
We do. So
Okay.
for every country, we collect information on people's reported income as well as other measures of wealth. We also collect data on their gender, level of education, health and disability status, among several other demographic variables.
Okay,
So, yeah.
so that would be great, and that data will be available as well?
Yeah, so the data that's available is not currently disaggregated. It's summary statistics, so it includes more detail than what is in the country profile, but it doesn't show all of the figures that you see there, also disaggregated by all of those demographics.
It would be a very thick document.
But yeah, if you do have questions, please reach out to us.
That's
And
great.
also we have a specific report on the rule of law in Pakistan, which includes an infographic on access to justice, but also additional data on legal awareness. And some of that data in the report is already disaggregated by gender and level of education. So that's a specific thing we did for Pakistan that we don't have for most other countries, but I'd invite you to look that up on our website.
Great, thank you.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the wonderful report that you guys have put together. My question is a little bit of a follow-up to David's comment about the intersection between civil law problems and criminal law problems. And I assume that you guys probably thought about that in the, that it came up in the development of the survey. And so, yeah, I was just wondering sort of how your survey dealt with that. If you have a civil law issue that maybe, whether it's a sort of breach of trust issue or a land issue that turns into a criminal arrest for trespass or something, how is that accounted for in the survey? Is there any way to sort of track that additionally? And sorry, I had one more follow-up question, but I lost it.
You know what? I'm going to grab a couple of questions because I'm realizing we're coming to the end of our hour. We probably can hang around and visit a little more afterwards, but I want to give everyone a chance to get their questions in. I've got one back here, and then I'm going to invite anyone on the phone to pose a question and then have some reactions. Yeah.
Thank you. I suspect the answer was stated and I missed it, but I found the proposed indicator for SDG 16.3.3 very interesting. And my question is, in noting that the first two indicators are exclusively focused on legal and not civil justice, why isn't civil justice specified in this proposed indicator?
Okay. Any questions from the phone? Okay, so we've got two questions there, and maybe I'll turn to you first, Sarah, but I think the others may also have thoughts, particularly on the indicator.
Sure. So in our survey instrument, in terms of what types of criminal problems are covered, most of the criminal problems that are covered are more petty problems in nature, so like antisocial behavior or issues being harassed by law enforcement. But we have a separate survey module that's modeled after the International Crime Victimization Survey that collects additional data on crimes that people might have experienced, but that is outside of the survey module. But I will say that there have been a number of papers done by a professor named Pascal Pleasance, and he looks at this question of what is called problem clustering. So it's the idea that problems beget other problems, and he does indeed find that certain types of problems are grouped together and that civil problems can snowball into criminal problems. And he's kind of like the godfather of legal needs surveys, but he actually started out studying criminal justice before he started looking at legal needs surveys. So there's actually a lot of good literature about this phenomenon that you're talking about, and this broader issue of problem clustering is one that we'd like to look at more in our data set.
So maybe I'll just respond to the question around the indicator. I think for us, if you look at the existing indicators on SDG 16.3, as you're saying, they're very much criminal focused, and one of them is the rates of victimization rates. And I think that looks at a lot of the criminal elements. We wanted something that would mirror that, but look at the civil justice aspect. So I think this is the sort of proposal that we came up with that would begin to look at issues.
Great, thank you. And also I should say congratulations on the report. I should have led with that.
Maybe I'll ask one wrap-up question, and that is to ask each of you to think about what if you could make a wish for one next step on this work, whether it's a research question to be answered or advocacy or solutions to be developed, what would it be? Sarah, you want to go for? Oh, you want to start?
I mean, I think for us, I mean, we've been, working around with everybody else's help in proposing this indicator. So we really would like to see this indicator be adopted. I mean, the process will go on, and I think the review is taking place right now, but it will eventually be adopted at the Statistical Commission in March 2020. So there is a lot of points along the way where people can engage in the process, and hopefully that it will be something, it would be an achievement to have that, and put it in this frame.
Excellent. Okay.
And
Sarah?
my wish would be for more and better data collected by countries. As I mentioned earlier, this data is really just the tip of the iceberg. But if countries and statistical agencies have the capacity to conduct these surveys, they're really able to do a deeper dive and look at specific subpopulations of interest and disaggregate it by administrative regions and things that we're not able to do ourselves with a sample size of 1,000 people. So this is my hope, is that countries draw inspiration from this methodology and these findings to collect more in-depth data.
Matthew, last word?
I think my hope is that it helps to make the case for more investment in justice, whether that's through government or private sector or philanthropy. I hope that it's making the case that justice is worth investing in, that it's intersectional, that it impacts education, health, labor, all of the things that we care about in terms of livelihood and well-being.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we can hang around and think about how we make all of those things come true. But let me end by thanking OSJI in particular for hosting us here tonight. So farewell to all of you on the phone as well, and I think we can probably hang around and enjoy the cookies for a little bit.
Indeed.
Thank you.